Hey, Biology 1409 students. I want to look at Chapter 20, the Fungus Kingdom or Kingdom Fungi with you. And if you are following along in your books, we're looking at Chapter 20 in the McGraw-Hill book, the Hufnagel's book, and it's Chapter 24 in OpenStax. And keep in mind that anything that is covered in the book that I don't talk about will not be something that you will be tested on. So in this particular chapter, there are a lot of things that we're not going to hit on. And so those things won't be on any exam or quiz that I give you. Fungus is probably not everybody's favorite subject, but they do have some pretty important functions in the environment and also economic and medical uses. And so I'm going to cover it kind of that way rather than look at all the different phylum names and classification. So I did put a kind of intro short video, the Fungus Storyteller. So when you get your, when you pull up the PowerPoint, I'd like you to take a look at that video, but I'm not going to take time to play it right now because it'll make this presentation kind of long. So just basic characteristics for fungi. Of course, they're eukaryotic, so they have a true nucleus. To be in the kingdom fungi, with one exception, organisms have to be multicellular, so they're made of more than one cell. Things that you would be most familiar with would be your mushrooms and your molds. The one example of a unicellular fungus is yeast. And all of these organisms are heterotrophic. They don't make their own food. They bring in organic material by absorption. So remember, they would be releasing enzymes into the environment, breaking down whatever the food source is, and then absorbing what they need and leaving the rest in the environment. Okay, so that term is saprotroph or saprotrophic, organisms that have external digestion. And this is an important function for fungi, decomposition, because if we didn't have fungi, and we've already talked a little bit about bacteria with this function, but if we didn't have these organisms, garbage and waste would just pile up and we'd never be able to get rid of it. And so whether it's remains of plants or animals or organisms in the soil, all of those things are broken down by the fungi. And like I said, they'll take up the nutrients that they need, but whatever is broken down that they don't need is returned to the environment. And so that's useful for the plants that are growing in the soil, but any other organisms that are found in the soil too. So I do want you to think about why these organisms fall into this kingdom and not into the plant kingdom or not into the animal kingdom. So we haven't done plants yet. We haven't talked about plants as a kingdom yet, but fungi have cell walls, just like plants have cell walls, but their cell walls have chitin in them, and chitin is a different kind of carbohydrate from cellulose. So plants have cellulose in their cell walls, and the fungi have chitin. Both of these would be considered, if you were eating plants or animals, would be considered fiber. So your body really can't digest and break down those carbohydrates, and so it's considered fiber in your diet. So something that we look at when we start looking at the animal kingdom too is that fungi, if they have extra sugars and they want to store these carbohydrates, they don't store them as starch, which the plants do, but they store them as glycogen, which is just another big carbohydrate. Okay, of course they're not green, they don't have chloroplasts, and they're heterotrophic, they can't make their own food. And so those are things that would make fungi different from plants. And then if we look at some of the differences between the fungus kingdom and the animal kingdom, in fungi there are no gametes, so we don't talk about sperm and egg. In fungus, fungus can't get up and move around like animals can. They can make their hyphae longer underground, but they can't actually get up and move around. And then I mentioned this when we were looking at the plants, but both fungi and animals will store the carbohydrates as glycogen. So they have extra sugar, they want to store it. We don't store it as starch, we store it as glycogen. So I took this from another book, this table. You do not have to memorize this table, but I do kind of like it for just a quickie comparison of the fungus, the plant, and the animal kingdom. So you can see the plants are photosynthetic, the other two are heterotrophic. The only ones that we see motility or movement is the animal kingdom. We're going to talk about the body of the fungus, which is made out of hyphae. I'm not worried about adult chromosome number because we're not going to go crazy about life cycles with the fungus. We talked about cell walls. Both plants and animals, or plants and fungi, have cell walls, different carbohydrate. Animals do not have cell walls. And then when we look at fungi, they reproduce by spores rather than using sperm and eggs. So that does make them a little different from the other two big kingdoms, eukaryotic kingdoms. So if we talk about the body, how the fungus organism is made up, it's basically composed of hypha. Hypha is basically your single filament here, okay? And it's made up of quite a few cells. If you were to pluralize the word hypha, it would be hyphae. We would add an E to the end of it, and that would make it plural. So we don't talk about hyphas, but hyphae would be plural, but you can see it's just a filament. If we put a whole bunch of these filaments together, we got what is called mycelium. That makes up the body of the fungus. So this word root, MYC, in Greek means fungus. And so basically it's a fungal body. It's lots of filaments. And it can grow over different organic things as it's trying to break it down. It can grow into the food source. It can grow underground, but then when it's ready to reproduce, it's going to produce a fruiting body that will come up above the ground. So in the lower picture here with the potatoes, you can kind of see that white hairy stuff on the potatoes. That's the mycelium, that's the fungal body, and if you leave your potatoes for too long, you're going to get spores that germinate, produce the hyphae, and you're going to have mold growing all over your potatoes, and basically what they're doing is breaking them down and decomposing them. So I just used a couple of different pictures, but here you can see comparing hypha to mycelium, and then you can see kind of what it looks like if it were growing over a leaf on the forest floor, and how that leaf would begin to be decomposed by the fungal organism. So I mentioned to you that when it's ready to reproduce a fungus, it will produce a fruiting body. So a mushroom, which you probably recognize, is the fruiting body of the fungal organism, okay? And so it's designed for reproduction. It's going to produce spores, which is how these organisms reproduce. And when the spores are released and they fall into the ground, then they're going to make new hyphae, grow into new hyphae, which when it's ready to reproduce, will produce another mushroom. So when you think about if you don't remember to clean out your fridge all the time, and you've got leftovers stored in some container in the back of your fridge, and you clean out your fridge after 2 months and you open up the container and it's covered in hairy stuff, that is fungus, okay? So it's starting to break down your leftovers. If it's covered in kind of slimy stuff, that would be bacteria. Okay, but both of those are decomposers, and that's going to happen to the food in the back of your fridge also if it's left there for too long. So this picture is nice just because you can see that in the fruiting body, in the mushroom, you also have all these hyphae that make up the body, but it will also produce spores. And I kind of like this part of the picture here where you can see the underside of the mushroom cap. And in there are gills, and within those gills are just tons and tons of spores. So maybe when you were a kid in 1st or 2nd grade, you did spore prints and your teacher brought in mushroom caps and you just put them upside down on a piece of paper and let them sit for about 10 minutes. When you pick it up, you're going to see a print of all the spores that were lined up within the gills of that mushroom cap. So in talking about reproduction in fungus, the spores can't move. They don't have flagella or cilia or anything like that, so they're non-motile, which means that they're dependent on wind or water or maybe insects to pick them up and move them around. And in your book, she does go into some life cycles of different types of fungi, and I am not worried about life cycles, okay? So be aware that we have spores produced sexually or asexually, but that's not going to be something that I'm going to test you on in terms of which are which and that kind of thing. So interesting, just short video here of a puffball, and it shows how the spores are dispersed, which I think is an interesting one. And then I mentioned that asexual spores are sometimes called conidia. So if we look at this, and this is an electron micrograph, you can see that the top part of that hypha is just covered in spores. And that's the reproductive structure for the fungus. Okay, so couple of other things to think about in terms of functions of spores and why they're important in the fungus. This is what allows the fungus to get to new food sources, because if the spore flies by wind a little bit of a distance from the fruiting body, you're going to grow new hyphae in that area, and then you're going to be able to take advantage of the food sources in that area. Spores, just like endospores in bacteria, help fungus resist adverse or difficult situations and conditions. And so if it's too hot or too dry or too cold, the spores will survive, and when the environmental conditions are better, then they will germinate and produce new hyphae. And if you're producing spores by combining, which sometimes we describe here as sexual, even though there's no eggs or sperm, then you're going to get new genetic combinations because you're combining DNA from two different fungal organisms. And so that's important for diversity because you get these new genetic combinations. So your book does have this very simple general life cycle. And so it shows that whether you produce sexual or asexual spores, they will germinate to produce hyphae and mycelium, okay? And then you may produce a fruiting body, you may produce sexual spores or asexual spores, and that part I'm not going to be really picky about, but I want you to realize that your spores are either germinating to produce hyphae, you get a lot of hyphae together, you make your mycelium, and then you may have a fruiting body, which is going to produce more spores. So just a little, again, for perspective, and these are numbers, I'm not good at remembering numbers, but just for perspective on what's happening with the fruiting body here, how many spores does an average mushroom produce per day when it comes up? So we're talking 30 billion. That's a lot. If you have mushrooms coming up in your yard, they don't last for very many days, and so the fruiting body is just there long enough to disperse the spores, and then it basically dehydrates. But it's already produced these billions of spores, which will grow into new fungal hyphae. Okay, how big is the largest fungus? So when we say 3.4 miles, that is humongous, but that is basically measuring all the hyphae that are underground. We don't have a mushroom up above the ground that's 3.4 miles big, but we're measuring the body, the mycelium that's underground. And this mushroom is a honey mushroom. It's the largest living organism that we know about. It's the oldest living organism. It's over 8,000 years old. Found in the northwest of the United States. So I have just a couple of pictures here. On the left is bracket fungus. So you might have seen that it looks kind of like mushrooms growing out from the side of a tree. That's also a fungus. And then on the right hand side are some fruiting bodies from the honey fungus, which is this humongous underground organism, and it will send up these fruiting bodies when it's ready to reproduce.